A billionaire abandons his deaf daughter and 30 years later, she buys her father's entire company. Rain fell in heavy sheets, pounding against the gleaming windows of the Evans Corporation's Manhattan headquarters. The air inside the top-floor boardroom, however, was tense and dry, charged with anticipation. Richard Evans, the billionaire at the helm of the corporation, stood at the head of the long conference table. His tailored suit reflected his usual sharpness, but there was a noticeable unease in his posture. The company had faced multiple scandals recently, and now rumors of an unexpected buyout were circulating among the staff. The boardroom door opened, and the room turned silent. In walked a striking woman in her early 30s, exuding confidence. Her dark, wavy hair framed a face that bore both kindness and steely determination. She wore an elegant navy dress that screamed power without needing to try too hard. Beside her was her attorney, a man as composed as she was commanding. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady but cool. "I am Clara Foster, the new owner of Evans Corporation." Richard froze. The color drained from his face as he processed her words. Clara locked eyes with him, her expression unwavering. It was the first time she'd seen him in 30 years. The father who abandoned her when she was 5 years old, unable to cope with raising a deaf daughter. 30 years earlier, Richard Evans had been a rising star in the world of finance, a man whose ambition knew no bounds. When his daughter Clara was diagnosed as profoundly deaf, Richard saw her as a blemish on his perfect life. His wife, Eleanor, had begged him to embrace Clara's uniqueness, to love her for who she was, but Richard had been unmoved. He left them both without a backward glance, sending occasional checks but cutting off all emotional ties. Eleanor, heartbroken but determined, raised Clara alone, teaching her that her condition was not a limitation but a strength. By the time Clara was 18, Eleanor passed away, leaving her daughter with nothing but her strength of character and an unyielding determination to succeed. Clara worked through college and law school, excelling in her studies while battling prejudice and underestimation. She eventually founded a company, Bright Horizons Tech, specializing in assistive technology for individuals with disabilities, a venture inspired by her own experiences. Over a decade, she turned it into a powerhouse in the tech world. But even as Clara built her empire, she could not ignore the pain of her father's abandonment. When she learned of Evans Corporation's struggles and its desperate search for a buyer, she saw an opportunity, not for revenge, but for closure. Now, standing before the father who had discarded her, Clara remained calm. Richard broke the silence, his voice shaky. "This must be a misunderstanding," he said, forcing a weak smile. "You're not serious." Her attorney laid out the documents on the table with the precision of a surgeon. "As of this morning, Ms. Foster owns 51% of Evans Corporation," he announced. "She has complete operational control." The room erupted in whispers. Clara watched Richard carefully, noting every flicker of panic and disbelief on his face. She had imagined this moment countless times, sometimes with anger, other times with triumph. But now, standing there, she felt none of the satisfaction she had expected. "Why?" Richard finally asked, his voice hollow. Clara took a deep breath. "To save your company," she said simply. "Not for you, but for the thousands of employees who depend on it." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "But don't mistake this for a reconciliation, Richard. This is business." Her use of his first name stung, but he had no ground to object. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words failed him. Later that evening, Clara stood in her new corner office, overlooking the city skyline. The rain had stopped, and the lights of New York sparkled like stars. Her assistant knocked softly on the door. "Miss Foster," he said, handing her a small box. "This arrived for you earlier. No sender information." Clara opened the box to find an old, tarnished silver bracelet. She recognized it instantly. It had belonged to her mother. Inside the bracelet was a tiny engraving. "Clara, my little star." It was something her mother had given her when she was just a child, and it had gone missing shortly after Richard left. She stared at the bracelet for a long time, emotions swirling within her. It was a reminder of the love she had lost and the strength she had gained. The first chapter of this journey had closed, but a new one was just beginning. Clara knew that taking over Evans Corporation was only the start. What lay ahead? Confronting her father, redefining the company's legacy, and possibly healing old wounds, would challenge her in ways she had yet to imagine. Clara stood in the hallway of her penthouse, holding the tarnished bracelet in her palm. The weight of the small object felt disproportionate, as if it carried the memories of a lifetime. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her mind. "You are my little star, Clara. Never forget that, even when the night feels the darkest." The sound of her doorbell snapped her back to the present. Setting the bracelet on the kitchen counter, she walked to the door. On the other side was Henry McAllister, her chief legal officer and longtime confidant. His perfectly pressed suit and the stack of files in his hands suggested that the evening would not be a quiet one. "Working late already, Henry?" Clara asked, letting him in. "You bought an empire on the verge of collapse." He replied with a wry smile. "You didn't hire me for my charm." Clara smirked and motioned for him to sit. The spacious living room, with its sleek minimalist decor, seemed an ironic contrast to the chaos brewing within Evans Corporation. "Let me guess," she said, sitting across from him. "We're bleeding money faster than we thought?" "Actually, no." Henry adjusted his glasses and opened the first folder. "The financials are bad, but manageable with your capital injection. What concerns me are the whispers." Clara arched a brow. "Whispers?" "Of a coup," he replied grimly. "The old guard isn't thrilled about the takeover, and some of them are trying to stir up trouble. They've been loyal to Richard for years, even as he drove the company into the ground." Clara leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Let them whisper. I didn't come this far to let a few relics stop me." Henry hesitated before continuing. "There's also something personal." He flipped open another file and slid a photograph across the table. Clara's heart skipped a beat. The image was of a woman in her late 50s. Her hair streaked with gray, but her features unmistakable. Eleanor Evans, her mother. "Where did you get this?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's from an anonymous source," Henry said. The message that came with it was cryptic. "She deserves the truth." Clara's mind raced. Her mother had passed away when Clara was 18, or so she had been told. She had attended the funeral, seen the grave. But the woman in the photo looked very much alive. The next morning, Clara arrived at the Evans Corporation headquarters early. The building, once a symbol of wealth and prestige, now felt cold and hollow. The employees she passed in the corridors avoided eye contact, their wariness palpable. She couldn't blame them. Most didn't know who she was or what she intended for their future. In her new office, Clara stared out at the city, her thoughts circling the photograph. Could it be real? Was her mother alive all these years, hidden away, while Clara had struggled alone? And if so, had Richard known? Her assistant, Marcy, knocked lightly before entering. "Miss Foster, Mr. Evans is here to see you." Clara's stomach tightened, but she nodded. "Send him in." Richard entered, his suit as sharp as ever, but his confidence seemed diminished. His once commanding presence was overshadowed by the awkwardness of the moment. He looked around the office, taking in the modern decor that had replaced the traditional furnishings he once preferred. "This used to be my space," he said, almost wistfully. "It's mine now," Clara replied coolly. "What do you want?" Richard hesitated, then sat down across from her. "I came to talk," he said. "Not about the company, but about us." Clara raised a brow. "There is no us. You made sure of that 30 years ago." "I deserve that," Richard admitted, looking down at his hands. "But I also need you to understand that it wasn't as simple as you think." "Oh, really?" Clara's voice sharpened. "Because from where I stand, it looked very simple." "You walked away." Richard flinched but pressed on. "I was scared, Clara. Scared that I couldn't give you what you needed. That I couldn't be the father you deserved." Clara's anger flared. "So instead, you abandoned me. Do you know what it's like to grow up thinking you're not enough? That the one person who was supposed to love you unconditionally couldn't even stay? Richard's face fell, the weight of her words sinking in. I don't have an excuse, he said finally, but I'd like a chance to make it right. Clara laughed bitterly. And why would I give you that chance now? Before Richard could answer, Clara's phone buzzed on her desk. She glanced at the screen and saw Henry's name. She answered, her tone brisk. What is it? Henry's voice was tense. Clara, we have a problem. There's been a data breach. Sensitive company files have been leaked, and it's making waves. I think it's deliberate. Clara's jaw tightened. I'll be there in a minute. She hung up and turned back to Richard. Whatever you're looking for, she said coldly, you won't find it here. By the time Clara reached the operations floor, the tension was palpable. Henry stood by a monitor displaying lines of code and flagged documents. It's bad, he said without preamble. These leaks include financial records, confidential contracts, and even internal memos. Someone's trying to destabilize us. Clara scanned the files, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. Any idea who's behind it? Henry hesitated. I'm still investigating. But he handed her a printout. At the top was a familiar name, Richard Evans. Clara's stomach churned. Could her father really be sabotaging her? Or was there someone else pulling the strings? Dig deeper, she ordered, her voice firm. I want answers by the end of the day. As Henry nodded and left, Clara returned to her office. The photo of her mother and the leaked files weighed heavily on her mind. Something wasn't adding up, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a storm she wasn't fully prepared for. She glanced again at the tarnished bracelet on her desk. If her mother really was alive, perhaps she held the key to unraveling the secrets of the past and to protecting the future. Clara stared at the bracelet lying on her desk, its tarnished silver catching the faint morning light. The weight of unanswered questions pressed on her shoulders. She leaned back in her chair, trying to organize the chaos in her mind. The mysterious photo of her mother, the deliberate sabotage of the company, and Richard's unexpected plea for reconciliation. Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Miss Foster, Henry is here. He says it's urgent. Clara straightened. Send him in. Henry walked in briskly, his expression grim, carrying a tablet. Without a word, he placed it on the desk and tapped the screen. A video began to play, a news report featuring the Evans Corporation logo prominently in the background. This morning, leaked documents from Evans Corporation have surfaced, revealing questionable financial practices under the leadership of its previous CEO. Richard Evans, the reporter said. The files suggest offshore accounts and possible embezzlement. Shares of the company have plummeted, leaving new CEO Clara Foster scrambling to contain the damage. Clara's pulse quickened. How bad is it? Bad, Henry replied. The media is eating this up, and investors are in panic mode. Whoever leaked these files knew exactly what they were doing. Clara clenched her fists. Do we have proof it was Richard? Henry hesitated. Not yet. The leak originated from a hidden server tied to the company, but the access points are all over the place. Could be him or someone trying to frame him. Clara sighed, running a hand through her hair. Keep digging. If this is his doing, I want evidence. If not, I need to know who's behind it. Later that day, Clara sat in the boardroom facing her executive team. The atmosphere was suffocating, tension radiating from every corner. She laid out her plan to stabilize the company, implementing strict transparency measures, appointing an external auditor, and issuing a public statement. Her team was receptive but wary. One by one, they voiced concerns about the damage to the company's reputation and the risk of losing key clients. As the meeting wound down, Clara noticed an older man sitting silently at the far end of the table. Charles Davenport, the company's CFO, had been a close ally of Richard for years. He had spoken little since Clara took over, but now his sharp eyes met hers. Miss Foster, he said, his voice steady. I hope you understand that the survival of this company depends on trust. And right now, the board is questioning whether you can command that trust. The room fell silent, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Clara refused to flinch under his gaze. The trust of the board is built on facts, Mr. Davenport. And I will provide them, she said. If you're questioning my leadership, I suggest you focus that energy on helping fix the mess we're in. Charles gave her a tight smile. Let's hope you're up to the task. As the executives filed out of the room, Clara felt her resolve harden. She wasn't just fighting for the company. She was fighting to rewrite the legacy her father had tarnished. That evening, Clara returned to her penthouse, her mind still racing. She poured herself a glass of wine, hoping for a moment of quiet reflection, but her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Your mother is alive. She's waiting for you. Be at the corner of 5th and Lexington at midnight. Come alone. Clara's heart stopped. Could this be real, or was it a trap? She stared at the message, debating whether to respond. Her instincts warned her against going, but the pull of the unknown was irresistible. If there was even a chance her mother was alive, she had to take it. At midnight, Clara arrived at the dimly lit intersection. The city had quieted, the usual hum of traffic replaced by the occasional distant siren. She wore a long coat and a scarf, trying to blend into the shadows. A figure emerged from a parked car, a woman in her late 50s with graying hair. Clara's breath caught as she recognized the woman from the photo Henry had shown her. It was Eleanor. Mom! Clara's voice wavered. The woman nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and sorrow. Clara, she said, stepping closer. I wasn't sure you'd come. Clara's legs felt weak. You're alive. All these years. Why didn't you tell me? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I wanted to, but I couldn't. Your father made sure of that. Clara's confusion turned to anger. What are you talking about? After Richard left us, he came back one night, Eleanor said. He was desperate, claiming he'd made enemies who were after him. He begged me to disappear to protect you. I didn't want to leave, Clara, but he said they'd hurt you if I stayed. Clara's chest tightened. You could have told me. I thought I was protecting you, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. But I see now that I was wrong. I'm so sorry. Before Clara could respond, the sound of tires screeching broke the moment. A black SUV sped toward them, its headlights cutting through the dark. Get down! Eleanor shouted, pulling Clara behind a parked car as gunshots rang out. Clara's heart pounded as she crouched beside her mother. The SUV sped off into the night, leaving behind only shattered glass and the acrid scent of gunpowder. Back in Clara's penthouse, Eleanor sat on the couch, trembling. Clara handed her a cup of tea, trying to process what had just happened. Who were they? She demanded. Why would someone try to kill us? Eleanor shook her head. I don't know, but if they're still after Richard, they may see you as a threat now too. Clara's thoughts raced. The sabotage at the company, the revelation about her mother, the attack, it was all connected. Someone was pulling the strings, and she was caught in the web. Mom, she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. I'm going to figure out who's behind this. And when I do, I'm going to end it. Eleanor looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and fear. Be careful, Clara. They won't stop until they get what they want. The morning after the attack, Clara stood in her office, her fingers drumming a restless rhythm on her desk. The events of the previous night were still fresh. Her mother's reappearance, the gunfire, and the SUV vanishing into the shadows. Every instinct told her she was being drawn deeper into a dangerous game, and she hated not knowing the rules. Her intercom buzzed. Miss Foster, Marcy said, her voice tense. Henry is here, and you'll want to see this. Send him in. Henry entered, holding a tablet in one hand and a printed document in the other. He looked like he hadn't slept, his tie slightly askew. I dug into the leak like you asked, he said, placing the tablet on her desk. And it's worse than I thought. Clara glanced at the screen. A series of encrypted emails filled the display, their subject lines ominous. Transfer of funds confirmed, sensitive data compromised, Evans' liquidation strategy. Where did these come from? Clara asked, leaning forward. Henry hesitated. The emails were sent from an internal company server. They're encrypted, But we traced the activity back to Charles Davenport. Clara's eyes narrowed. The CFO? Why would Charles sabotage the company? Henry handed her the document. That's the million-dollar question. But look at this: bank transactions from an offshore account tied to Davenport. A significant sum was deposited just days before the leaks began. Clara's jaw tightened. He's being paid to sink the company. But by who? That's where it gets murky, Henry said. The payments came from a shell corporation. Whoever's behind this knows how to cover their tracks. Clara's mind raced. The timing of the leaks, the attack on her and her mother, and now Charles's betrayal. It was all connected. But to what end? Later that afternoon, Clara summoned Charles to her office. He entered with his usual air of calm authority, but she noticed the faintest flicker of unease in his eyes. "You wanted to see me, Miss Foster?" he asked, sitting across from her. Clara wasted no time. "I know about the offshore account, Charles. I know about the money." His composure faltered, but only for a second. "I don't know what you're talking about." Clara slid the document across the desk. "This says otherwise." Charles's face paled as he scanned the paper. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "You don't understand. I didn't have a choice." "You had a choice," Clara said coldly. "You chose to betray this company." Charles's shoulders sagged, the weight of his guilt evident. "They threatened my family," he confessed. "If I didn't cooperate, they said they'd kill my wife and son." "Who are they?" Clara demanded. Charles hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. "I don't know their names. They communicate through intermediaries. But they're powerful, dangerous. This isn't just about money, Clara. They want control." "Control of what?" Clara pressed. "Evans Corporation," Charles said. "It's not just a company. It's a gateway to influence, political, financial, global. Whoever holds the reins can shape markets, sway governments." Clara's stomach churned. She had underestimated the stakes. That evening, Clara returned to her penthouse to find her mother pacing the living room. Eleanor's nervous energy filled the space. "Did you find anything out?" Eleanor asked. Clara nodded, recounting her conversation with Charles. Her mother listened intently, her face growing more troubled with every word. "Clara," Eleanor said when she finished, "this sounds like the same people who came after your father years ago." Clara frowned. "You're saying they've been after him this whole time?" Eleanor nodded. "Richard made powerful enemies in his rise to the top. He used to say that success wasn't about what you earned but what you could take from others. Eventually, he crossed the wrong people." Clara leaned back, the pieces starting to fit together. "And now they want Evans Corporation for themselves. But why? What's so special about this company?" Eleanor hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. "There's something you don't know. Before Richard left, he was working on a secret project. Something big. He called it the Keystone." "The Keystone?" Clara echoed. "What is it?" "I don't know the details," Eleanor admitted, "but Richard was obsessed with it. He said it would cement his legacy, make him untouchable." Clara felt a chill. Whatever the Keystone was, it had drawn dangerous attention, and now it was her problem. The next morning, Clara met with Henry in her private conference room. They pored over old files, searching for any mention of the Keystone. Hours passed with little progress until Henry stumbled across an encrypted file buried in the company's archives. "This might be it," he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he attempted to break the encryption. After several tense minutes, the file opened. Clara leaned in, her eyes scanning the text. The document detailed a sophisticated algorithm capable of predicting market trends with near-perfect accuracy. It wasn't just a financial tool, it was a weapon. Whoever controlled the Keystone could dominate the global economy. "This is what they're after," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded. "And they're willing to destroy the company. And you to get it." That evening, Clara made her move. She called an emergency board meeting, determined to confront the crisis head-on. As the board members gathered, the tension in the room was palpable. Clara stood at the head of the table, her presence commanding. "I know some of you have been questioning my leadership," she began. "But let me be clear. I will not let this company fall. And I will not let it be stolen. She turned to Charles, who sat near the center of the table, looking like a man awaiting his sentence. Mr. Davenport has betrayed this company, Clara announced. Gasps rippled through the room. But he is not the enemy. He's a pawn in a larger game. She then laid out her plan. A full audit of the company's operations, the deployment of advanced cybersecurity measures, and the immediate deactivation of all access to the Keystone. The board members, though wary, had no choice but to agree. As the meeting adjourned, Charles approached Clara, his expression weary. I'm sorry, he said. For everything. Clara met his gaze. Prove it. Help me find the people behind this. Charles nodded. I will. Later that night, Clara stood by her window, staring out at the city. The storm she had walked into was far more dangerous than she had imagined, but she was no stranger to adversity. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You should have stayed away, Clara. Now it's too late. Clara's jaw tightened as she stared at the message. Whoever was behind this had underestimated her resolve. Let the storm come, she thought. I'm ready. The next morning, Clara stood on the balcony of her penthouse, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, her eyes fixed on the sprawling city below. The weight of the unknown pressed heavily on her. The threatening text from the night before lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. She felt the stakes rising, the unseen enemy closing in. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was Henry. We have something, he said without preamble. What is it? Clara asked, her voice sharper than she intended. There's a meeting happening tonight, Henry replied. High-level players tied to the shell corporations funding Charles's account. We traced their communications to a private club in Midtown. If we're going to get answers, this might be our best shot. Clara set her cup down. Send me the details. By nightfall, Clara stood outside the Meridian, a luxurious, members-only club hidden behind an unmarked door. The air was heavy with the scent of cigar smoke and secrets, and Clara could feel her nerves thrumming beneath her calm exterior. She adjusted the lapel of her sleek black coat and nodded at Henry, who was stationed across the street in a parked car. His voice came through a discreet earpiece. You're sure about this? I don't have a choice, Clara said, stepping toward the entrance. Keep the line open. The doorman, an imposing figure in a tailored suit, eyed her warily. Invitation? Clara didn't flinch. Tell them Clara Foster is here, she said, her voice steady. The man hesitated, but after a brief pause, he nodded and opened the door. They're expecting you. Inside, the club was a haven of opulence, its dim lighting casting a golden glow over the polished marble floors and leather armchairs. The low murmur of conversation filled the air, punctuated by the occasional clink of crystal glasses. Clara's gaze swept the room, noting the calculated ease of its occupants, all of whom carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to power. A man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed and exuding quiet authority, approached her. His piercing blue eyes fixed on her as he extended a hand. Miss Foster, I've been looking forward to meeting you. My name is Victor Caldwell. Clara recognized the name immediately. Victor was a renowned financier, his empire built on navigating the grayest corners of legality. If anyone could orchestrate the chaos engulfing Evans Corporation, it was him. Mr. Caldwell, Clara said, shaking his hand. I didn't realize I was on your radar. Victor smiled, his expression disarming but calculated. Oh, you've been on my radar for a while. But I must say, your recent acquisition has made you quite the topic of conversation. Clara forced a polite smile. Is that so? Victor gestured toward a secluded table in the corner. Let's talk. As they sat down, Victor leaned back in his chair, studying her. You're a remarkable woman, Clara. To rise from obscurity and take over Evans Corporation, impressive. But I wonder, do you know what you've stepped into? Clara met his gaze, refusing to blink. I know enough, including the fact that someone is trying very hard to destroy what I've built. Victor chuckled softly. Destroy? No, my dear. What's happening is evolution. The old ways are dying, And Evans Corporation is a valuable piece of a much larger puzzle. And you want to control it, Clara said, her tone icy. Victor leaned forward, his smile fading. Control isn't the right word. Stewardship. I can offer you protection, resources, power. All I ask is your cooperation. Clara's jaw tightened. And if I refuse? Victor's expression darkened. Then you'll find out just how deep this goes. You think the leaks were bad? That's nothing compared to what's coming. Clara's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. You think I'm scared of you? Victor smirked. Not yet, but you should be. Before Clara could respond, Victor's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then rose from his seat. Unfortunately, I have another matter to attend to. But think about my offer, Clara. You're smart enough to know which way the wind is blowing. As Victor walked away, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her earpiece crackled to life. Clara, Henry said. His voice urgent. We have a problem. 2 men just entered the club, heavily armed. I think they're looking for you. Clara's heart raced. Can you get me an exit? Working on it, Henry said. Stay calm. Clara rose from her seat, keeping her movements casual. She made her way toward the back of the club, her eyes scanning for an escape route. The 2 men Henry had mentioned were moving purposefully through the crowd, their eyes darting around the room. She ducked into a hallway lined with private rooms, her pulse pounding. Henry, she whispered. There's a service exit at the end of the hall, he replied. Take it now. Clara quickened her pace, her heels clicking against the polished floor. As she neared the exit, one of the men stepped into the hallway, his gaze locking onto hers. Stop right there, he barked, reaching for his weapon. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed a nearby wine bottle and hurled it at him, shattering it against his arm. He stumbled, giving her just enough time to sprint toward the door. She burst through it into an alley, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. Run, Clara! Henry shouted through the earpiece. She bolted down the alley, her breaths coming in short gasps. Behind her, she heard the heavy footsteps of her pursuers. She turned a corner, only to find herself facing a dead end. No, she whispered, panic setting in. The 2 men rounded the corner, their weapons drawn. Clara backed against the wall, her mind racing for an escape. Just as one of the men raised his gun, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the entrance of the alley. The door flew open, and Richard Evans stepped out, his expression grim. Get in, he shouted. Without hesitation, Clara dove into the SUV. The tires squealed as Richard hit the gas, speeding away from the alley. Clara turned to him, her chest heaving. What the hell are you doing here? Richard's grip tightened on the wheel. Saving your life. Back at Richard's safe house, Clara paced the room, her adrenaline still coursing. How did you know I was there? She demanded. Richard poured a glass of scotch, his hand steady. I've been keeping tabs on Victor Caldwell for years. He's dangerous, Clara. I knew he'd come for you. Why? Clara asked, her voice rising. What does he want? Richard's eyes met hers, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. The Keystone. He's been after it since the day I created it. And now he'll stop at nothing to take it. Clara's breath hitched. You're telling me this is all because of you? Richard nodded. I made a lot of mistakes, Clara. But I swear, I'll do whatever it takes to fix them. To protect you. Clara stared at him, her anger and fear warring with a tiny flicker of something she hadn't felt for him in decades. Hope. Clara stood in the dimly lit safe house, her arms crossed as she faced Richard. The weight of his confession, that the Keystone was the root of their troubles, pressed down on her like a vice. For decades, she had resented this man for abandoning her. But now he was offering his protection, and perhaps a way to end this once and for all. Why didn't you destroy it? Clara asked, her voice cold. If the Keystone is so dangerous, why did you let it survive? Richard took a long sip of scotch before setting the glass down with a soft clink. I thought I could control it, he admitted. That it was my legacy. But I was wrong. Caldwell and his people have been circling ever since. waiting for the right moment to strike. And you let it get to this point? Clara said, her frustration mounting. Do you have any idea what they've done to me? To the company? Richard looked at her, his expression pained. That's why I'm here, Clara. To stop them before it's too late. But I need your help. Clara let out a bitter laugh. You need my help? After abandoning me and Mom? After leaving us to fend for ourselves? I know I failed you, Richard said, his voice soft, but I'm trying to make things right. Not just for you, but for your mother too. Clara's heart clenched at the mention of Eleanor. She's alive because of you, isn't she? Clara asked, her voice trembling. You told her to disappear, didn't you? Richard nodded. It was the only way to keep you both safe. But it came at a cost. A cost I've been paying for ever since. Clara turned away, staring out the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but they offered no comfort. Her mind raced with possibilities, her anger warring with the need to take control of the situation. Finally, she turned back to Richard. What do we need to do? She asked, her voice steely. The next morning, Clara and Richard sat with Henry in the safe house's makeshift command center. A map of Evans Corporation's headquarters was spread across the table, marked with circles and notes. We need to get to the servers, Richard said, pointing to a secure wing of the building. That's where the Keystone is stored. Once we're in, I'll initiate a complete data wipe. Henry frowned. That's easier said than done. Caldwell's people will be watching the headquarters. And if you wipe the Keystone, they'll come after you even harder. That's why we create a diversion, Clara interjected. We leak false information that the Keystone has already been moved. While Caldwell's people chase shadows, we go in and destroy it. Henry raised an eyebrow. You're playing a dangerous game. Clara smirked. I've been playing one since the day I bought the company. That night, Clara, Richard, and Henry arrived at the Evans Corporation building under the cover of darkness. A skeleton crew of employees was working the night shift, their presence a mere formality in the nearly deserted offices. Clara's palms were slick with sweat as they slipped through a side entrance, their footsteps echoing softly in the empty halls. Henry led the way to the server room, his expertise in cybersecurity proving invaluable as he bypassed the building's digital defenses. Richard followed close behind, his expression grim but determined. This way, Henry whispered, gesturing to a steel door at the end of the corridor. The servers are behind that door. I'll need a few minutes to get it open. Clara nodded, her heart pounding as she kept watch. The air was thick with tension, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, Henry's device beeped, and the door slid open with a hiss. The server room was vast, its walls lined with blinking lights and humming machines. Richard moved to the central console, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Once I start the wipe, there's no turning back, he said. Do it, Clara replied, her voice firm. As Richard initiated the data wipe, the sound of approaching footsteps made Clara's blood run cold. She turned to see Charles Davenport stepping into the room, a gun in his hand and a look of regret on his face. I'm sorry, Clara, he said. I didn't want it to come to this. You don't have to do this, Charles, Clara said, taking a cautious step forward. Caldwell's using you. You're just a pawn to him. Charles's hand trembled, but he didn't lower the gun. He promised my family would be safe. I can't take that risk. Your family won't be safe if you help him, Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. People like Caldwell don't keep their promises. But if you stand with me, I'll protect them. I swear. Charles hesitated, his eyes darting between Clara and Richard. Finally, he lowered the gun. What do you need me to do? Clara let out a breath of relief. Help us buy time. As the data wipe neared completion, alarms blared through the building. Caldwell's men had arrived, their footsteps echoing down the halls. Clara and Charles moved to barricade the door while Henry worked to delay the breach. Richard, how much longer? Clara shouted. 2 minutes, Richard replied, his voice strained. The door rattled as Caldwell's men began pounding against it. Clara's heart raced as she braced herself, knowing they were out of time. She grabbed Charles's gun, her hands steady despite the chaos. The door burst open, and chaos erupted. Clara fired, the sharp cracks of the gunshots echoing in the confined space. Caldwell's men returned fire, the server room filling with smoke and shouting. "Done!" Richard shouted. "The Keystone is gone. Time to go!" Clara yelled, grabbing Richard by the arm and pulling him toward the exit to BY Dawn. Clara, Richard, and Henry were safely back at the safe house. The events of the night felt like a blur, their adrenaline fading into exhaustion. Caldwell's men had retreated, their prize lost, but Clara knew the fight wasn't over. "You destroyed the Keystone," Henry said, "but Caldwell won't stop. He'll come for you." "Let him," Clara replied, her voice firm. "I've faced worse." Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Clara. You did what I couldn't." Clara met his gaze, a flicker of emotion crossing her face. "Don't let it go to your head." As the sun rose over the city, Clara stood by the window, her resolve stronger than ever. She had saved the company, protected her legacy, and begun to heal old wounds. But she knew her journey was far from over. For the first time in decades, she felt ready to face whatever came next.